welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. One of the things that I like about the question and answer episodes of the podcast is that it gives us an opportunity to discuss some quite broad subjects when it comes to the history of the Great War. And that's something that you seem to like too. Rather, as in the main episodes where we focus on one area or one layer of the First World War, in these episodes we get to kind of dip into some subjects, make us hopefully think about those subjects, learn from it, and perhaps seek out more knowledge, because within the confines of an episode like this, we can't possibly cover these subjects in depth, but they've certainly made me think about future ideas for podcasts further down the line. And those subjects that we're going to talk about this time are just as broad and also come from quite a broad element of our audience. People from North America and Australia, as well as from the UK. And it was quite interesting over the Christmas period to have a look at our podcast statistics to see who listens to the podcast, where they listen from. It's probably not a surprise that most of the audience is from the UK, but there's a growing element of listeners from the United States and also from Australia and New Zealand. And one thing that was particularly of interest to me is the age of our audience. Now, I don't know exactly how some of these podcast platforms work out the age of listeners and how accurate that is, but I was quite surprised that nearly a quarter of our audience are under 35, which kind of bucks the trends, I suspect, of what most people think of in terms of age and demographics when it comes to those interested in the First World War. Perhaps people see it as a subject for an older audience, but what is really interesting is that it is just as when I was a teenager all those decades ago. It's something that still seems to engage a wide and including a young audience as well. So the ambassadors of the future who will carry this forward and hold that torch of remembrance and ensure that the history of the Great War is not forgotten, I feel very, very hopeful about that. Anyway, let's get back to our questions and answers. As always, you submit these, and you can do that via two methods, via email or via the Discord server, and links to both of those are in the show notes. So let's begin with question number 1, which comes from Nick Perry in the United States via email. In one of the very first question and answer episodes, you mentioned that there is now a monument, which might not be the right word, for the Great War Indian soldiers in Belgium. Are there any other monuments or memorials for the Indian or African soldiers on the Western Front, or for the many Indian, African and Chinese labourers who provided immense assistance to the Allied armies on the front? My guess is no, but wanted to see if you know of any. My interest in Colonial and other non-whites in the war was piqued by David Olusoga's book, The World's War, Forgotten Soldiers of Empire. Well, a fantastic question, Nick. If you go back into some of the earlier episodes of the podcast, there's one about Britain's Black Army of the First World War, looking at black soldiers in the British and Commonwealth forces in the Great War. And that was the subject of my master's thesis 30 years ago when I was doing my MA. So it's something that's always interested me. And you're right that I did mention that there is a memorial to Indian troops in Belgium, but let's just go back first to what was created in the immediate post-war period when the memorialisation of the Great War took place. It was, at the time, no doubt seen as predominantly a white man's war, unfairly, because it was a world war and men and women from all over the globe were involved in it in all kinds of different ways during those 4 years of the conflict. And in terms of the wider British and Empire experience as it was then every corner of that empire supplied men for the front in one way or another, not necessarily as fighting troops, often as labour troops. And you mentioned some of those there. The Indian Army are the ones that are doing the fighting, but there was also an Indian Labour Corps, there was a South African Native Labour Corps, British West Indies Regiment, which became a labour unit, and then eventually the Chinese Labour Corps. Now, China wasn't part of the British Empire, but we recruited over 100,000 men from China to come and serve on the Western Front during the Great War as part of that Chinese Labour Corps, a unit of the British and Empire forces, and it played a major contribution to the outcome of victory, as you suggest. Now, in that immediate post-war period then, the only ones that were memorialised were the ones that did the fighting, and that was the Indian Army. The Indian Army names of their missing and soldiers who died, and their remains were cremated as per their religion, were added to the Menin Gate if they died in Belgium, and then a separate Indian Corps memorial was created at Neuve Chapelle to commemorate 4,500 Indian soldiers who died in France who have no known grave, but also to memorialise the deeds of that Indian Corps in the battles of 1914 and 15 on the Western Front. And they played a major role in that. The Indian Corps arrived in October 1914 via Marseille and came up to the front, took part in the First Battle of Ypres, served in the fighting around Neuve Chapelle and in the Battle of La Bassée, and then in some of the offensives of 1915 on the Western Front as well. So a major and important role in those early battles of the Great War. And then most Indian units were moved off to places like Mesopotamia and Palestine to fight the Turks in what was then the Ottoman Empire. But Indian Labour Corps soldiers came to the Western Front in the latter part of the conflict, and the memorial, I guess, memorialises them as well, although that would have been much lesser known then, I suspect. So that was the kind of official memorial. To all those other non-white units that we've mentioned at the time, there were no specific memorials. Those have all largely come about as a consequence of, or as a reaction to, the Great War centenary between 2014 and 2018. So quite a few Indian communities in Britain got together with people in Flanders and in France and erected a whole series of memorials. There's one to one of the first Indian actions near Hollebeek in October 1914, which is a kind of little brick structure with a plaque on it. There's one at Bazentin recording the Indian cavalry who made the attack on High Wood in July 1916, overlooking that battlefield, and another one at Villers-Guislain on the Hindenburg line, where Indian cavalry was in 1917. So those are some of the later memorials to the Indian Army. There was no kind of Indian Army statue as such placed on the battlefields, because in the minds of the British government, the wider empire, they were commemorated by the Neuve Chapelle Memorial. In terms of the British West Indies Regiment, they still to this day only have a few memorial plaques here and there, but there's no actual memorial to their troops. And the South African Native Labour Corps are commemorated at Delville Wood now, in the wider museum there that tells the story of South Africa in both World Wars. And while their dead are commemorated in cemeteries or on memorials to the missing, the SS Mendi, a troop ship full of South African Native Labour soldiers, sunk off the Isle of Wight in 1917, and they're commemorated on a memorial to the missing in Southampton, for example. So there's that kind of commemoration, but no actual kind of central monument to them. In terms of the Chinese Labour Corps, again, they're buried in British and Commonwealth cemeteries. And the Chinese Labour Corps also has some separate burial sites, such as the Chinese Cemetery at Noyelles in the Bay of the Somme, or the Chinese and Indian Cemetery up at Ayet, in between the Somme and Arras, for example. But in Flanders, close to Popperinge, there is a relatively new memorial to the Chinese Labour Corps that has some bronze statues of Chinese Labour Corps men moving the shells and doing their work and commemorating them properly. So what we're seeing is a retrospective look at just how wide this World War was and how many men from how many different nations and how many backgrounds came to serve in this war, and rightly more and more of them are now being commemorated. But in that immediate post-war world, the world then was very different. And the participation and the role that these kind of men had in this conflict was largely ignored. That was wrong, but at least we are in a position to write that now. And David Olusoga has done a lot of work on this. His book, his television series, and other authors as well, has kind of brought these faces out of the past so they are properly recognised. So hopefully, Nick, a little bit more than you were perhaps expecting, and I hope if you get to the battlefield sometime in the future, you get a chance to see some of these more recent memorials and the way that these men are commemorated. So a great question, thank you. Question number 2 comes from Bob Beach on email. Bob asks, I have a question I've occasionally pondered from time to time on the back of an argument I once heard with a couple of veterans. One bemoaned that everyone got the same gongs, whether they were over there for 4 years or 4 weeks. They said there should have been battle bars to show where a soldier fought. It kind of makes sense, so my question is, was there ever any serious consideration for bars to show which of the major battles or campaigns they had served in? Well, a brilliant question, Bob, because if you look at the history of British medals before the Great War, the issuing of bars for campaigns or specific battles was very commonplace. The most recent conflict on a large scale was the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902, for which the Queen South African Medal was issued, and that has general kind of state bars like the Cape Colony or Orange Free State, but specific battle bars as well for actions like Mafeking, for example. Now, when it came to the commemoration of soldiers for the Great War, you're absolutely right, and that conversation that you overheard with the veterans is true. There was a minimum qualification period depending on what arm of service you were in. In the Navy, you could get a British War Medal, for example, for serving 28 days continuous service, even at a shore station. So the men in the Navy got one medal for 28 days service in Britain, which the Army didn't get. They had to go overseas to qualify for medals. And you can indeed have soldiers who arrived in the theatre of war. I researched one some time ago who landed in France on the 9th of November 1918 and qualified for the British War and Victory medals as a consequence of that. So he got the same medals, for example, as men who arrived on the Western Front in January 1916 and just got the pair, British War Medal and Victory. Mutton Jeff, it was often called by the veterans, he got the same medals as them for a few days' service compared to their several years' service. And that's not just true for the British War and Victory Medal. You can even have a scenario, for example, where you can look at a group of medals to a private in the Army Service Corps, the 1914, often called the Monstar, with the British War and Victory Medals indicating that he's been there from the very beginning of the conflict. But in the Army Service Corps, he could have been part of the Field Bakery in Rouen, and he could have spent the entire war there. And he got the same 3 medals as a man who fought at Mons, Le Cateau, the Marne and the Aisne, First Battle of Ypres, and then perhaps was wounded and then came back for the Somme or Passchendaele or whatever it was. So the veterans themselves latterly were not happy with the way that these medals were issued, and the symbolism was the same for everyone despite what you'd done. Now, unbeknown probably to most of them, the War Office, the Admiralty, and many others began to look at the idea of issuing battle bars. And in fact, we see evidence of this on the medal rolls for the British War and Victory medals that are now on Ancestry and Find My Past, and previously were part of the series WO329, the medal rolls at the National Archives. And if you look at those, for any soldier, there are columns to issue the bars, and a whole load of bars were planned for First Battle of Ypres, Second Battle of Ypres, Third Battle of Ypres, and so on, First Battle of the Somme, Battle of the Ancre, First Scarpe, and all these kind of battles. So a whole series of battle bars were planned, And I think that they worked out the maximum that a soldier would get could be 20 odd of these bars. I think that number kind of rings a bell somewhere. So you can imagine, and they were going to be placed on the British War Medal ribbon. So that would have had a very long section of ribbon for some of these men, with bar after bar after bar for these men. And my great uncle, for example, he would have had a mighty collection of these, having arrived in France with the 2nd Battalion of the Essex Regiment, my Uncle Dan, and served with them at Le Cateau, served with them on the Marne and the Aisne, and in the First Battle of Ypres, wounded during the winter of 1914-15, then served at Gallipoli, then was wounded on the first day of the Somme, and came back, and then served at Lens and Arras, and was wounded at Cambrai. So, he would have had a big collection of those in just that kind of period of service. But when they looked at how many men would be entitled to these bars and the cost of minting them and then issuing them and the complexity of working out who would qualify for which bar, then the whole idea was shelved and the bars were not issued. There are examples of them out there. I've seen medals come up for sale in auction with these battle bars on, which are often described as tailor's copies. So there must have been some kind of design put out there, and maybe some tailors offered this as a service after the war, where veterans could go along and buy whatever bar they fancied to put on their medal. I don't remember a single veteran of all the hundreds that I interviewed ever talking about these bars, so I don't know what the awareness of them was, but I have seen quite a lot of naval medals with naval bars for Colonial in the Falklands, for Jutland, for Gallipoli, and other naval actions of the First World War. So again, the Navy planned that. Somebody had some designs for some of those, and they occasionally appear for sale in medal auctions. But it was not something that was ever put into place. The plans were there, the medal rolls were obviously prepared, and that's what we see with the medal rolls that survive today, but they were never implemented and the bars were never issued. So the veterans continued with their gripe for the rest of their lives, looking at a man who they knew had spent 4 years at the base and got the same medals for them, who had served on the front line and been in some of the toughest and the deadliest and challenging battles of the First World War from a soldier's experience. So a great question, Bob, which has a kind of a basis in fact, but unsurprisingly, when we look at how that generation of veterans was treated when they came back from the Great War, unsurprising that yet again the government kind of let them down and didn't really acknowledge the contribution that they'd made on the battlefield. So today, when we look at our own ancestors who served in that war, we can only speculate as to what bars they might have received for their service in the Great War. So thanks for that, Bob, and we're going to move on to question 3. This comes from Evan in Queensland, Australia, via email. He asks, I am an avid listener to your wonderful podcast, thanks Evan. As I sit with a beer in hand after mowing the lawn, I tune into what you have to say. My question is, what is the German equivalent to the Victoria Cross, and do you know any exploits that these men did to be a recipient of this award? Well, the Germans did indeed have an equivalent of the Victoria Cross, and it's a medal called the Pour le Mérite, or the Blue Max. That's its popular name. The Pour le Mérite was a decoration instituted in the 18th century by Frederick the Great, Old Fritz, who, as the King of Prussia, had stamped his way across Europe, fought victory after victory, and wanted their bravery to be recognised, and he brought in this award. Now, Pour le Mérite, that's not German, that is French, and the court of Frederick the Great was dominated by the French language, and that's why the medal has a French title, which translates as the Order of Merit. And the name Blue Max is something that came out of the First World War. And when I say Blue Max, many of you think of the film starring George Peppard about a fictionalised German fighter ace of the First World War who is given this decoration for bravery. But in fact, that title, Blue Max, is a First World War title for the medal, and it comes from Blauer Max, as the Germans would say, and is a reference to Max Immelmann, who was a famous German fighter pilot of the Great War, often called the Eagle of Lille. So it was named kind of after him, or it references him in that name. So it was Germany's highest award on the outbreak of the Great War in 1914, and it was a medal that continued to be issued up to the end of Kaiser Wilhelm II's reign in 1918. And then in the interwar period, these kind of decorations did not exist, and then it was reconstituted, if you like, or a replacement medal was put in place by the Nazis, by the Third Reich, which was known as the Knight's Cross, but that's out of our kind of subject area for this. Over 5,400 Pour le Mérites were issued during its history, and there's a book out there by Kevin Brazier, published by Pen and Sword, that lists them all. I'm not entirely sure how many, what percentage of that is for the Great War, but it's a very high percentage, as you can imagine. And in terms of the kind of men that were issued this award, it includes some of the very famous names of the First World War. The top of that list has got to be Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who was Germany's greatest ace in many respects of the First World War, who flew in combat over the Western Front for a wide period, commanded a squadron until he was shot down in 1918 over the Somme, and was awarded the Pour le Mérite in January of 1917, just as his squadron began to gear up to fight the Royal Flying Corps over the battlefields at Arras in what became known as Bloody April, when the Germans got the upper hand. And his brother Lothar, who flew in the skies over the Western Front as well, also got the Pour le Mérite in May of 1917 for that period of Bloody April. And one man who flew with Richthofen in the skies over France and Flanders was Hermann Goering, who was also awarded the Pour le Mérite in June of 1918. So three men very much connected with the war, Germany's war in the air over the battlefield, and Blauer Max, which was the nickname for the Pour le Mérite, Blue Max. Max Immelmann was a fighter pilot too. So just like with the issue of the Victoria Cross to pilots of the Great War on the British side, such as Albert Ball or Jimmy McCudden or Mick Mannock, it was the same kind of exploits that pilots from Germany's air forces got their highest award for. And in many cases, these awards would be given in special medal parades in which the Kaiser or the Crown Prince would come and pin this medal round the neck of the soldier. It was kind of like a Maltese cross-shaped with a blue enamel and gold finish. The reference to blue, Blauer Max in the name is because of the design of the medal, and it was hung round the neck of the recipient so that it was always in a very prominent place. And obviously this was something that filled the German press, stories of these awards, in the same way that the Victoria Cross filled the press of Britain and its wider empire. But it wasn't just men in the air that were given this medal. Men on the ground fighting for the various battlefields over which the German army fought during those 4 years, they were decorated with the Blue Max as well. And at the top of that list in terms of famous names would have to be Erwin Rommel, later of course the Desert Fox. Rommel was an infantry officer in the Great War and was awarded the Pour le Mérite for fighting on the Isonzo front when German units went to serve alongside their Austro-Hungarian comrades, fighting against their Italian enemies, the Italian army on that front. And he got the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, in October of 1917 for bravery when he led a detachment on the Isonzo front. And that's something you can read about in his account, his book called Infantry Attacks, which is reprinted and widely available. But in terms of some of the great battles that we've often discussed on this podcast, the attack at Verdun in 1916 resulted in the award of the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, for a number of officers and men who were involved in the capture of key positions. Captain von Brandis, for example, who was one of those credited at the time with the capture of Fort Douaumont in February of 1916, he was one of those who was very publicly awarded the Pour le Mérite for his bravery there. But those who were involved in the capture of other forts like Vaux were also decorated in that way. You don't really have to go very far. And if you read some of the books by Christina Holstein on the fighting at Verdun, you'll find quite a few examples of these highly decorated officers and men involved in the battles there in both 1916 and 17. But Ernst Junger is also a very famous name, arguably famous name, connected to the story of the Blue Max, the Paula Marite, because he was awarded that in September of 1918. Junger, who served with the Hanoverians on the Western Front from 1915 until the end of the war, wounded multiple times, fought in some of the great battles like on the Hindenburg Line or on the Somme at Guillemont and so many other places, survived that war, decorated with the Blue Max, and wrote, more importantly for us, wrote his memoirs in 2 key volumes, Storm of Steel, which many of you may well have read, translated into English, published in the interwar period, and been in and out of print ever since, and there's a new paperback translation of it available right now, I think, from Penguin Books, and his other book, Cops 125, looking at the fighting around Gommecourt and what the British called Rossignol Wood in 1918. A less interesting book, but nevertheless an important one. And Junger was a great survivor. He lived to the age of 102, dying in 1998. And when I first moved to the Somme in the mid-1990s, as his 100th birthday approached, he was due to give a talk at the Historiale at Peronne about his wartime experiences. And I had my first editions of his books all ready for him to sign, but unfortunately he became unwell at the last minute and he wasn't able to make it. And sadly, I wasn't able to shake Ernst Junger's hand and meet him and hear him talk. A great regret, as you can imagine, on my part. But some of his artefacts, including his Blue Max, have been on display at the Historia Museum at Peronne for many years, including one of his Stahlhelms that he was wearing when he was very badly wounded, absolutely peppered by bits of shrapnel. So it's an important decoration of the Great War. It recognised a huge number, a wide range of acts of gallantry on the battlefield, above the battlefield, at sea, in U-boat crews, for example, as well. We haven't mentioned that. They were awarded to members of Germany's U-boat fleet in the First World War. So it's a world war, fought on all kinds of fronts, and the decoration very much reflects that. And it's an important part of our understanding of the history of the Great War through these acts of gallantry. But I'm sure, I don't know what the German saying for it was. I think I've told you this a few times on the podcast. One of the veterans that I knew, he always used to say there was only 2 types of crosses, the Victoria Cross and the Wooden Cross, and most got the latter. And I'm sure German frontline fighters would have had their equivalent of that, seeing many, many unrecognised, unmarked acts of gallantry not receive not even an Iron Cross, let alone a Paula Marite. So the whole aspect of gallantry in the First World War, a fascinating one. And thank you, Evan, for giving us that opportunity to talk about it. So we're on to our 4th and final question now, which comes from Bill Petterson on email. Bill asks, perhaps a year ago you invited the Hawthorn Ridge Crater Association principals to your member live stream. Brilliant stuff. And it was a really interesting talk by the lads who managed the Hawthorn Ridge crater. Bill then asks, I should have asked at the time but did not. Were the average infantrymen alerted before the explosion, or did only the officers know what was about to happen? Now that's an interesting question. When you think of the use of mines in that underground war of the Western Front, when men of the Royal Engineers tunnelled underneath the battlefield, or Australian or Canadian or New Zealand engineers, all of whom did this kind of work, when they tunnelled under the battlefields, that work would take a lot of time. Sometimes the infantry soldiers would be involved in it. One of the veterans that I interviewed, Horace Ham, he was in the 16th Middlesex, and in the approach to the Battle of the Somme, he got dragged into the work that 252 Tunnelling Company were doing in the preparation for the blowing of the Hawthorn mine, and he went down into the tunnels and worked down there alongside the sappers. So the infantry obviously knew about this work going on, but were they told when it was going to go off? Well, in most cases they were. And this was something that was learned quite early on in the use of these mines. If men were not told, and there was not that kind of information out there, particularly in respect of the timings of the explosion of these mines, then men could attack and walk straight into the explosion of one of these charges going off, and obviously that would cause friendly casualties. You would be seeing your own men blown apart by the explosion of this mine rather than the Germans on the other side of no man's land. So while the use of these mines in that early period often had its problems, and often there was an issue with the synchronization of watches between sappers, between engineers, and the infantry as to when this thing was going to go off, which would result in men either being unnecessarily killed by their own side, or, much more commonly, soldiers hanging back in their trenches, waiting for that mine to go off, and the whole momentum of the battle began to break down. So what you see as the mines become more and more an essential part of some of these big attacks with the Somme and later Messines is that men were told that at 0 hour, whatever the time of the attack would be, this is when the mine will go off, this is when you will attack, and you will not hang back in your trenches. Even if the mine has not exploded, you will still attack. And there were some examples of that happening in the Battle of Messines in June of 1917, that kind of finest hour of the tunnellers in many respects. So this passing of intelligence information to ordinary soldiers is something that generally would not have been done in the early phase of the First World War. Once a citizen army arrives on the Western Front, many of those in the high command don't believe that citizen soldiers can really grasp what soldiering is all about or understand it, so they don't believe in telling them things. But as the war progresses, it becomes clear that the more a soldier knows, the better he can perform on the battlefield. And generals like Plumer, who commanded the offensive at Messines in 1917, were very much the kind of architects of this. Plumer took all of his men out of the line, took them to models of the battlefield where they were briefed and they were told what their division was doing, what their brigade was doing, what their battalion was doing, and what the battalions on their flank were doing. So the idea behind that was it was risky because those men could get captured and spill the beans to the enemy. But the idea was that if they went into an attack and all their officers got killed or wounded, then they would know what their task was and they could continue to fight and achieve their objectives. And what you also see by 1917 in British units, Canadian units, and Australian units, and many units that are part of the British Expeditionary Force, is the widespread issue of maps to ordinary soldiers, not just officers. So that information as to the topography of the battlefield, where positions are, is something that becomes much more widespread as you move into that final couple of years of the fighting on the Western Front. And the use of mines like the Hawthorn mine and the timing of them and relaying that information to the ordinary soldier all becomes part of that. So in the approach to 0 hour on the Somme on the 1st of July, not just at Hawthorn Ridge, but in the other areas where mines were about to detonate, soldiers were told this. I remember reading a story of a soldier in the Tynesiders who braced himself against both sides of the trench, and when the mine went off, the shockwave came through the soil and he was pushed by both sides of the trench and it broke his legs, injured him. He couldn't go over the top, couldn't go into battle, but it saved his life because most of the men in his section, platoon, company, battalion became casualties in the subsequent attack. So men were told what they could do with that information, apart from be aware of the fact there was going to be a huge bang in front of them, is pretty limited, really, but it's all part of the way the army changed in that final phase of the conflict, particularly with the fighting on the Western Front. So thanks for that, Bill, and I'm sure that we'll have the guys from the Hawthorn Ridge Crater Association back on one of the supporters' evenings, or perhaps talk to them here on the podcast about the work that they do, which is so important. And they've kind of transformed, really, that site at Hawthorn and opened it up and made it accessible in a way that it wasn't going right back to those early years of when I first went there in the 1980s. So it's a very positive kind of outcome to see a site, an important site like that, properly managed and preserved. So thanks for all your questions this week. It's been another fascinating episode for me to answer these questions and talk about these different and quite contrasting aspects of First World War history. And if you want to ask a question, and there's no such thing as a silly question, then send them in via the two main methods, email and the Discord server, and there's links to both of those in the show notes. And I'll see you again soon for some more questions on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.